Hello, everyone. I'm Jennifer Doliak, a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center and economics professor at Texas A&M University. Welcome to the third webinar in our five-part series on how to reduce violent crime. Each hour-long webinar consists of 5 short presentations of research by leading scholars in this space with an emphasis on policy takeaways. We know that many are concerned about rising rates of shootings and homicides in many US cities and hope that this research provides useful guidance for communities that are wondering what they can do to improve public safety and save lives. If you missed the first 2 webinars, you can find the recordings on the Niskanen Center website. And we're going to move quickly through these 5 presentations today. So we're going to start off with Sarah Heller. Sarah, you have 10 minutes and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. I think there should be a new Olympic event in how fast you can share your screen. You guys can see that okay? Great. Thanks, Jen, and thanks to the Niskanen Center for hosting. So when we think about violence, social scientists often focus on root underlying causes, things like concentrated poverty, gangs, neighborhoods with long histories of underinvestment, and so forth. And these root causes are by definition important. They deserve sustained policy attention, but they also present deep ingrained problems that take a long time to solve. And in the meantime, people are dying every day at unacceptable rates. And that's especially true for young Black men, who die from homicide at 24 times the rate of their white counterparts. And so what I'll talk to you about today is a possible part of the solution, which turns our attention to a much more proximate cause of violence, how people make decisions in the few moments leading up to a violent event. And the thinking here borrows from an idea in psychology called dual process decision making, most famously discussed in Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, from which we borrow our paper's title. And the idea is that we all engage in a lot of behavior that doesn't come from careful, considered thinking, but rather from automatic subconscious thought, what he calls system 1 processing. As one trivial example, you probably can't tell me how many doors you've opened today because you haven't thought about doing it. Your brain sees the door and follows an automatic script. Your body follows along without you consciously making the decision. It just knows what to do. And there's a lot of evidence that our brains have all kinds of scripts for all kinds of behavior. So it seems plausible that at least some violence might also come from this system 1 thinking. When you look at Chicago, which is the site of our studies, it turns out that something like 73% of homicides stem from an altercation. Now, some of these altercations may have premeditated or instrumental motivations, but a huge number of them look like fights over something trivial, a bike, a pair of shoes, or just looking at someone the wrong way. And in those moments, if someone recognizes a situation where they feel threatened or insulted, their brains may just follow the scripts they've learned through years of experience of living in dangerous neighborhoods or even in dangerous homes, which is act tough, right? Use violence. And that's often adaptive. They've learned that response because it's helped protect them in the past, just like we all develop automatic responses that help us in our own lives. But when it's deployed in the wrong moment, for example, when someone else is carrying a gun, it can have deadly consequences. Now, fortunately for us, psychologists have developed a way to help people slow down in those key moments, recognize how their automatic thoughts generate potentially undesirable actions, and more consciously consider and choose alternatives that might avoid the bad consequence. And that strategy is called cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. So CBT is a way of teaching people to think about their own thinking, recognize how automatic thoughts and beliefs lead to behavior, and then practice other behaviors to help avoid or change those thoughts. And it's been in use since the 1970s, including for things like depression, anxiety, smoking cessation, and other kinds of behaviors that people want to change. The key idea is to learn to recognize when you're in a key moment, a hot moment, and then slow down and be a little more reflective rather than reflexive, at least when that's appropriate. And in fact, the interventions I'll tell you about completely avoid lessons like don't get angry or never fight because they're not helpful. Anger is a normal emotion, and there are situations when it's actually important to fight to avoid harm. The idea is just to take a moment to think more carefully about which kind of situation you're in before doing something that escalates to violence. So what our paper does is evaluate a couple different programs that aren't clinical CBT, but are built around these kinds of CBT principles. So I'm gonna start by explaining to you one of the first exercises in a program that's called Becoming a Man, or BAM, which is run by a nonprofit called Youth Guidance. So to start, the counselor pairs up all the boys in the room. He gives one of them a ball to hold, like you see in the picture, and tells the other that his job is to get the ball within 1 minute. And then he says, there's only one rule. There are no rules. Go. Well, you can imagine what happens when you tell a room full of adolescent boys that there are no rules. Total chaos ensues. After a minute, the counselor blows the whistle. They switch roles so that there's sort of equal opportunity bashing going on. And then the counselor calls everyone back to debrief. And he says, okay, tell me about how you tried to get the ball. And the kids will say, well, first I tried to lunge, but he was too quick. So then I grabbed his wrist and went for the kidney punch. And the counselor says, interesting, interesting. How many of you asked for the ball? And there's always crickets. And he says, okay, why not? And someone will inevitably say, well, he wouldn't have given it to me, or he would have thought I was a wuss, or some less clean version of wuss. And the counselor says to the partner, is that true? What would you have done if he just asked for the ball? And often he gets responses like, I probably would have just thrown it at him. What do I care about the stupid ball? And the counselor says, aha, look at that. You were wrong about what he thought. And that starts a conversation about how you know what other people are thinking, how your assumptions might get in the way of what you want, and how asking for what you want is a different tactic that might work better. And then everyone gets a homework assignment to try asking for what they want in a given situation and report back about how it goes. So you can see how this is a much more engaging way to start kids thinking about their own process of thinking and the consequences that come next than just sort of lecturing them about not getting angry. And of course, the whole intervention is much more complicated than this, but I hope that this exercise gives you sort of the basic flavor of what a CVT influence intervention might look like. Okay, so now, how do we know if it works? Well, we did 3 separate studies. The first one, we tracked over 2,700 7th to 9th grade boys in the Chicago public schools. And since there's never enough money to serve everyone you think could potentially benefit, we used randomized lotteries as a way to fairly allocate the limited slots that we had. And so that sets us up with a treatment group that's offered BAM and a control group that isn't. And we can then track their outcomes in administrative data and be sure that any difference between those 2 groups is because of the program itself. So that's what we did. And we found that those participating in the program had 45% fewer arrests for a violent crime at the end of the program year, which is a really huge decline. Now, you might wonder if we just got lucky. We sort of did this once. And so we actually went out and did the whole study again with a new group. We lotteried and tracked about 2,000 9th to 10th graders this time. And this time the program was stretched out over 2 years. And here again, we found at the end of the program years, a 50% decline in violent crime arrests, very much like the first study. So this seems very promising, but it's also only one program. And so our third study turned to a different program in a different setting, the Juvenile Detention Center in Cook County, which is where Chicago is. Now here they used a different curriculum, not BAM, in part because you can't encourage kids in detention to beat each other up for a ball, but it's the same kind of lottery study. And here at the detention center, we found a 21% decline in readmissions to the detention center after release. So even here, with a group at much higher risk of negative outcomes, we see a CVT-based curriculum changing behavior. So what do we take away from all of this? Well, it looks like adolescents' violent behavior is remarkably responsive to relatively modest investments in teaching them to think about their own thinking. And when I say modest, I don't mean easy. The implementation matters, but it's not years of therapy. In the first study, kids participated an average of only 13 sessions. Now, I want to be clear that this approach is not a panacea. It's not going to stop all violence, which is probably not surprising since we're not addressing some of the root causes I talked about at the beginning. And there are important open questions about how lasting the program effects are. Now, there has been success in other settings and other curricula, including in places like Liberia and El Salvador, but there's also some indication that scaling up could be hard. That said, we calculate that the benefit cost ratios of the program are somewhere between 5 and 30 to 1 from just the crime decline, depending on how you calculate the social cost of crime. That's where the range comes from. And as high as 70 to 1 if you count the fact that BAM also increased high school graduation. So even though this kind of programming won't necessarily stop all violence, it seems like a hugely promising way to start making a dent. And we should surely be investing more in learning how to scale successfully and who can deliver it in what settings and the other kinds of implementation issues that really matter. So in the meantime, I want to leave you with one final thought, which is something that one of the detention center counselors said when we were visiting. He was telling the kids, if I let you redo just 10 minutes of your lives, none of you would be here. And so for the kinds of violence that might come from a quick, hot, in the moment mistake, we have pretty good evidence now that we actually might be able to help them get some of those 10 minutes back. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sarah. And John McDonald, you are up next.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll see how fast I can also share my screen. So this is okay. So this is a good complement to Sarah's presentation, because I'm going to be talking about actual structural changes to places and how remediating infrastructure disadvantaged communities can reduce gun violence. So it's a well-known fact. Kind of the motivation behind this is that gun violence and serious crime is highly concentrated by place. Anywhere from 3 to 6% of street segments, for example, account for about 50% of reported gun violence and serious crime. The concentration of gun violence by place also appears to be relatively stable over time, suggesting there are endemic features of violent crime hotspots. So we see this in even recent work with during the pandemic, the rise in shootings and homicides. You see the areas with the chronically highest rates suffered the worst. And this suggests at least that thinking more strategically about the routine activities of places and how to regulate those places may be more easy to address in routine activities of persons. This is a quote from Larry Sherman from his work on hotspots of crime. So the question then naturally is, what are the salient features of the built environment that we think about that could be changed to reduce gun violence and serious crime? And so that's what I'm going to present an example of that from some of our work. So this is just to give you a graph of Philadelphia. So if we look at, for example, Philadelphia from 2015 through the end of 2020, we see about 2.3% of street blocks are responsible for 50% of the shootings. 10%, about 11% are responsible for all shootings in the city. And for those that are academics and think about statistical significance, if we compare this to kind of a simple Poisson process, it suggests that shootings are highly concentrated, more than we get by chance. So it turns out that one of the features of the built environment that we see again and again, not just in Philadelphia, but in cities across the country that suffer from chronically high rates of gun violence are either vacant lots or abandoned buildings. There's a literature in criminology that suggests that these types of, this kind of neglected feature of the built environment tends to generate crime, especially maybe when it's in the presence of other aspects of the built environment that bring people together, like schools, transit station, bars, or taverns, so places that generate human activity, especially among strangers. And there are some theories to suggest why this might, in particular, these features of the built environment may be particularly endemic to high rates of crime. So for example, physical disorder research suggests, descriptive research at least, that influences neighborly socialization. This has been coined the term collective efficacy by Rob Sampson, Felton Earls. So if you think about vacant lots and they're overgrown with weeds, tall grass, these may send a signal that there's kind of a hole in the social fabric of a community. It may diminish the perception that residents feel like they can act as guardians for these places when they're overgrown and uncared for. And it may even shape our unconscious social interactions, or what Jane Jacobs kind of famously noted in her work about not just eyes upon the street, but this idea of that there are natural proprietors of places. So when an area is abandoned, it's neglected, people may withdraw. This also connects to the original formulation of broken windows theory, and the idea that physical disorder leads to a reduction in informal social control. I'll make it very clear, I'm not talking about broken windows policing, I'm talking about broken windows theory. If you actually read the article where they talk about this how disorder leads to other people to think that area suffers from a lack of informal social control. And also it connects to some work, some theories about how physical disorder and land use can even just shape criminal opportunities, or the situational aspects of crime. So we see this in work on crime prevention through environmental design, Ron Clark's work out of the United Kingdom on situational crime prevention, and the Branningham's work on what they refer to as crime pattern theory. So I'll give you a tangible example now. So in Philadelphia, since the late 1990s, there's been a program called Philadelphia Land Care that is engaged in strategically going around the city and remediating vacant and abandoned lots. So this is an example of their work that they do before and after treatment. So what you can see is they basically, they'll hard scrape out an area, they'll plant grass, they'll install this unobtrusive fence that allows people to walk onto the property but not back up a truck. Often they'll plant some bushes or trees, and then this gets cared for on a bi-weekly basis between March and November during the season, kind of the planting and growing season in Philadelphia. This started as initially a pilot program in one community in an effort to deal with abandoned spaces. And it was just a pilot in the Kensington neighborhood with the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society who ran this program, and then it's been scaled up over time. For those that might be interested in this program, I would point to the website on PHS, and in particular, highlight Keith Green here, who manages this program. Keith's been working at PHS and actually in land care, initially doing the work himself, and in the last 20 years, moving up to actually running the program. So some recent research we've done both experimental work as well as quasi-experimental work on this program. And so I want to just kind of give you an example here from a recent publication in the Journal of Experimental Criminology, where we looked at lots that were remediated between 2006 and 2018. And we compared those to abandoned lots that had yet to be remediated in the same general locations of the city. So this is a massive program, as you can see. Just in that time period, PHS took over control of over 4,000 lots. But City of Philadelphia, like many cities, legacy cities, suffering from disinvestment, deindustrialization, still has plenty of abandoned lots to be treated. So I'll just highlight the bottom statistic. You can ignore all the other rows of data here. But what I highlight here is if you look at the change in robbery between lots that were greened versus those that weren't, but are similarly situated, we see a 21% reduction in robbery. We see 11% reduction in drug-related offenses, a 9% reduction in public order, and a total crime reduction of 5.6%. We also in this paper looked at how that might interact with different land uses nearby that could be crime generators or suppressors. And we found that the effects were actually bigger, if you will, if they weren't done near a train or a bar. So in other words, you may get some greater crime reduction benefit when this work's done strategically, especially in residential communities. We also we did a randomized trial where we had 541 lots that were randomly assigned to be either remediated or not, left on a wait list. And we found comparable results, reductions in robbery. Here we actually found reductions in assaults, drug offenses, public order offenses, and total crime. The size of the effects are kind of similar, but they're on different scales. One's looking at thousands of lots. This is looking at 541. We also had some survey data, so we did look at social cohesion to see if that improved around lots that were remediated. And we found some suggestive evidence, but not statistically significant in terms of questions of asking people about how much time they spend socializing with their neighbors, watching out for each other, et cetera. In terms of actual gun violence, the work from this randomized trial, we found that shootings were reduced significantly around lots that were received either full treatment or even a partial treatment, which is basically just picking up the trash, and mowing the lots on a bi-weekly basis. There's several studies that I kind of highlighted here, but all kind of the conclusion is from across all the different studies we've done on this program, starting out initially a study in 2010, the more recent one I highlighted, as well as this work on shootings. We found consistent effects of Philadelphia's land care program. And I'll just point out, but this program is not alone. It's not just something happening in Philadelphia. It's happening in cities around the country. Chicago has a similar program, Youngstown, Ohio, Flint, Michigan, and even New Orleans has started a similar program. And this and other aspects of how we can change the built environment to improve community safety is highlighted in my book, Changing Places, which is written for a general audience, has no equations or math in it. So thank you very much. I enjoyed the chance to present this work.
Great, thank you, John. Morgan Williams is up next.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Morgan Williams. I'm an economics professor at Barnard College, Columbia University. I'll be presenting some of our joint work entitled Police Force Size and Civilian Race, involving my wonderful co-authors, Aaron Chalfin, Benjamin Hansen, and Emily Weisbers. And so one thing that I think that we want to kind of acknowledge is that probably over the past few years or so, there's been a renewed energy around discussing police reform in the United States. And in no small part is that due to the Black Lives Matter movement and many of the different facets in which they've discussed policing reform and how in ways in which we can improve policing in the United States and elsewhere. But also more recently within this kind of larger defund debate. And of course, if you talk to anyone, defund probably will give you each person will probably give you a different definition of defund. But largely speaking, they're kind of discussing this idea that if we reallocate certain parts of the budget from policing to other kind of interventions or social service agencies, that perhaps we can still see improvements, if not more improvement, in public safety. And so one thing that I think is kind of interesting to kind of discuss is obviously, in thinking about necessarily how to change the scope or the responsibilities of law enforcement, it is important to kind of know exactly what it is that law enforcement does. And so there's been a great deal of evidence. I highlight a very small fraction of that evidence here regarding the importance of police employment, which is a very, very important policy lever that's used by municipal leaders, and also just the visibility of policing, whether it be in hotspot policing or whether it be in other matters, just having police around sometimes can lead to reductions in crime in meaningful ways. And so one thing that me and my co-authors kind of thought was, well, perhaps there's kind of more to this. This kind of leans into a larger part of my kind of research agenda. And that, perhaps these differences in the returns to policing or the cost of policing, so to speak, could differ as we go across Black and white communities. So one example of how, different communities could benefit from policing might just involve the fact that there are kind of, segregated kind of patterns in street vice. Concentration, or it could just be for the mere fact that Black Americans account for about 13% of the population and over 50% of the homicides. It could be that the allocation of police itself, if the police say, okay, we're going to prioritize homicide as a public safety matter, we might then dedicate some of those policing resources to certain communities more than others. That could lead to efficiency gains. And so, these are some reasons that we could kind of think of police employment in particular, including increasing the police force size, as being a meaningful policy intervention. There's also notable costs that we want to consider. And so to speak, what we've seen surrounding RCTs involving hotspot policing is the idea that perhaps police legitimacy, it seems to change when you engage in these types of practices. But also we have to acknowledge the fact that if we increase, the presence of the police force just in sheer numbers, that also can lead to certain increases in the number of interactions with civilians. And anytime there's an interaction, that could lead to a use of force incident. And so we want to be very careful, given some of the kind of budding literature on the racial disparities in use of force. And we want to kind of see, whether or not the police are doing, a fairly good job in reducing things like homicide victimization, and in addition to their enforcement activity, which is dedicated to addressing some of those concerns. So what are we going to do within this particular study? I'll just kind of get straight to the point. We're interested in estimating the causal impact of increasing the police force size on a number of kind of key outcomes. primarily being homicide victimization, as I mentioned before. We're also going to look at homicide clearance rates. As a kind of a prelude, we don't find much in the form of homicide clearance rates, but that's noteworthy within itself, and I'll talk about that towards the end of this presentation. We're also going to take a look at different types of arrest or enforcement activity, which will include quality life, what we call quality of life arrest, which involve generally these kind of low-level kind of misdemeanor offenses that are generally seen as maybe victimless, but could also kind of lead to a court fine or lead to some other type of criminogenic effect that we might want to be concerned about. But there's also these index arrests, in which we're talking about more serious crime, rape, robbery, murder, etc. And we're also going to kind of acknowledge the fact that with an arrest, they're kind of like two different components. It's what the police do, in addition to what people do in terms of their offending behavior. So we're going to benchmark that against index crimes. And so how do we go about doing this? We put together a sample of about 242 large US cities in the United States based on their population in 1980. We have two different strategies, but this one I'll talk about today focuses on the period from 1990 to 2018. We use a whole, kind of slew of different kind of data sources in order to kind of get at this particular issue. I won't talk about all of them here, but we'll kind of just note that we kind of use different measures of police employment within the paper to our advantage. But in kind of considering this kind of this specific relationship between police foresight and homicide victimization or arrest, there could be a number of different concerns that could come about or in the form of alternative explanations. It could be that, the police employment measures that we use, whether they come from a city manager or whether they come from the police department themselves, could have some measurement error within them. And that measurement error could actually be something that could be quite costly in terms of the precision of our estimates, in addition to the whether or not we have bias within those estimates. We're also concerned with whether or not there might be some omitted variable or whether or not, the police are able to kind of get ahead or anticipate crime waves, or there might just be some other kind of instance, some other type of source of or predictor of homicide or arrest that we're just not considering. So in that way, we, much of the literature or a good bit of this literature is focused on the COPS program, which I'll talk about in a second, and now we'll kind of focus on exclusively today for the sake of time. So in kind of talking about COPS, the Department of Justice Community-Oriented Police Services Office, it was established under the 1994 crime bill with the goal of distributing block grants to police departments throughout the United States. Hiring grants can constitute about half of the funding within this initiative, and the rest kind of going towards technology, targeted crime initiatives, et cetera. COPS grants are reviewed on a number of different factors: fiscal need, application narratives, and other funding constraints. But what we're going to kind of lean on here as a policy experiment is the mere fact that, well, maybe within these grants, there's going to be a number of eligible hires that are specified for each grant that is awarded. So we can account for changes in police employment that are attributable to COPS alone. And so what we see within our particular sample is that the average grant generally is about for $21 million and for about 143 officers, or we kind of see about a 2.5% increase in police employment. So COPS does lead to some significant changes in police employment from one year to the next. And I should also note that the kind of funding availability has changed as we've gone from one administration to the next. So today, again, I will focus on the COPS estimates themselves. Again, we kind of use two different empirical strategies in order to kind of get at this issue. They produce very similar results. As I mentioned before, COPS does lead to meaningful changes in police employment, so I won't talk about those results exclusively today. And we also kind of don't see much in the form of an impact on clearance rates. So how should we interpret the estimates that I'm going to show you in a second? Well, what we're going to see is the point estimates that I'm going to show you is going to be the effect of one additional cop on beta, more or fewer outcomes, whether that be homicide victimization or different types of arrest. But we also kind of know that there's different kind of representation within the population and also in homicide. So one thing that we're also going to do is we're going to kind of benchmark our results to the population and give this to you in per capita terms as well. So what do these estimates kind of show you? This shows you the impact of one additional cop on beta, more or fewer outcomes per 100,000 residents. And so last thing that I will kind of note is that statistically, we obviously want to test the primary focus of this paper is on racial disparities. We want to be able to test whether those effects are statistically distinct from one another. So let's just focus on homicide victimization. Again, what are the effects of hiring one additional officer on homicide by race? Well, again, I'm going to show you a table here. In the left-hand column, I'm going to show you the different kind of outcomes that we'll kind of focus on primarily. And then I'm also going to show you in the next column, the coefficient, and give you some sense of how precise this is, in addition to the benchmark, that per capita estimate here. And again, we want to be able to kind of provide standard errors. We'll show the mean and the number of observations. So turning to homicide victimization itself, we see here that, again, the marginal officer abates about 0.1 homicides in total, but it's about equal when we go across Black and white homicides. Again, these estimates are not, statistically distinct from one another, as we can see here. But when we look at it in per capita terms, this is indeed the case. And so this means that the public safety gains are larger among Black Americans than white Americans with respect to homicide victimization in per capita terms. This also means that if we want to kind of abate one homicide, that means we need to hire on average about 10 to 17 officers. Next, let's just turn to the question of quality of life arrests. Again, these kind of low-level misdemeanor arrests across racial groups. Again, what we see here is that the marginal officer kind of makes an additional 8 quality of life arrests when it involves a Black arrestee, and about 14 for whites. One thing that I will note is that unlike the homicide arrests, which account for Hispanic ethnicity, these don't. And so there could be, as we see elsewhere in the literature, many kind of Hispanics being classified as white within this category, which can also change maybe how we kind of view these estimates somewhat. Again, in per capita terms, they're kind of somewhat different, even though the evidence isn't necessarily as strong here. And so we do see meaningful changes in the number of quality of life arrests that we should be kind of concerned about. So moving to index arrests and index crimes. One thing I will note is that we cannot break out index crimes by race, but we can again do that for arrests themselves. And so what do we end up seeing here? We see that the marginal officer again makes 1 fewer arrest for Black arrestees, and then for white arrestees is about 0.5. If you look at this in per capita terms, this reduction in index arrest is much greater for Black Americans and white Americans. And one thing that we also kind of see here, just as a kind of barometer of sorts, is that not only are police making fewer arrests when we increase the size of the police force, but they're also abating crime, and so they're index crime, and so they're kind of avoiding some of this more serious crime within communities across the country. About 24 for the marginal officer. And so again, this kind of tells us that there could be a double dividend here, in which we're having both reductions in arrests that tend to be accompanied by lengthy prison sentences, in addition to the crime itself. So what is kind of, to just give you a sense of what's going on here, what can kind of be driving these quality of life arrests and these index arrests? Well, if we focus on the quality of life arrests first, the red kind of points in being the point estimates for Blacks, disaggregated into different categories, the blue ones being for white Americans. And then we're also going to kind of just show you whether or not they were statistically distinct. Here you can see that the racial disparities of quality life arrests are actually concentrated in liquor law violations and drug possession. If we turn to index arrests, we see that much of the crime that seems, the arrests that are being avoided here for these more serious crimes tend to involve robbery, burglary, theft, and motor vehicle theft, things that you would kind of sensibly think of as if you put more cops out on the street, their kind of visibility and their numbers could possibly avoid in much more strategic ways. So just to kind of conclude here, we think that this is kind of really important evidence, kind of thinking about the scope of policing in order to kind of have this larger conversation about policing and what the police should and should not be doing. We should have some sense of what the historical record has to say. Our estimates kind of show you, again, what those historical opportunity costs of investing in one more officer might mean, rather than kind of investing those funds somewhere else. But something, as I kind of noted before, is that we also want to kind of think more clearly about what's kind of increasing police efficiency when it comes down to things like homicide. As I kind of note here, Joe Levy's wonderful book, Ghettoside, kind of gives us some type of sense of what that policing production function might look like. But this is something that we're going to want to hone in on as we kind of get engaged in future work. I also kind of want to note that there can be an important divergence in both perceived public safety needs and the actual law enforcement practices and policies that are implemented. And so whether it be stop, question, and frisk, or whether it be the type of policing that was taking place in Ferguson, Missouri, these types of policy divergences are important because they can have larger impacts on the police's ability to do their own work in a kind of a general equilibrium sense, but also it can just kind of lead to this kind of this violation of rights and privacy, and also just citizens, just a sense of respect. And so, and wanted to kind of acknowledge these things and also improving better policing, we want to kind of think about what exactly should be kind of the tailored solution to many of these communities. As has already been noted, policing itself is not a panacea. And so there are going to be a number of different other interventions that we kind of note here: Office of Diversity, Summer Youth Employment, CBT, as Sarah's already mentioned earlier in this webinar. So there are other kind of interventions, and we want to think very carefully not only about how these interventions kind of work and how they can kind of serve as maybe a substitute for certain policing responsibilities, but also how they scale up. And so these are all kind of very important considerations within this larger context, but we also want to note that the police themselves seem to be a very kind of important policy lever to kind of think about as we move forward. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you, Morgan. Mike LaForest, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jen. Just share my screen here. All right, great. So today I'm going to talk about our work looking at the effects of gang takedowns in New York City. And this is joint work with Aaron Chalfin at University of Pennsylvania, as well as Jacob Kaplan at Princeton University. So our work is going to be focused on the large decrease in crime that occurred in New York City since 1990. And while a lot of research has been done to try to understand why it decreased from its peak in 1990 to 2000, where crime decreased by about 200%, very little work has been done looking at the continued fall in crime in New York after that time period. So from 2000 to about 2018, crime in New York City fell by an additional 200%. And that sort of has been kind of overlooked a little bit in some literature. And there's still sort of uncertainty about what are the main drivers of this continued downward trend, which, as we've talked about, we've seen start to creep up a little bit in the last couple of years again. So there's been a lot of candidate measures and ideas about what's causing this, whether it's gentrification or the eradication of lead paint, improvements in police technology, the decreased use of stop, question, and frisk, for example, in New York after 2000 and 2010, particularly 2010, and sort of moving away from that, broken windows style of policing to some more precision type of policing. All of this happening while the police force in New York City stayed relatively constant. So one additional mechanism that we're going to discuss here is the NYPD's increased use of gang takedowns. So they started focusing more on a precision policing policy, where they were going to focus on sort of the individuals that were the largest drivers of violence in the city by focusing particularly on these gangs that were potentially driving this crime. And over this time period, the NYPD started focusing more on this, and the number of gang takedowns occurring in the city increased substantially. So what are these gang takedowns more generally? So these are going to be situations where the NYPD collaborates with the DA's offices throughout New York, as well as federal authorities, to build conspiracy cases against gang members and particular gangs who are involved in violent crime in the city. And they're going to spend months to years putting together these cases based on previous violent crime that's been conducted based on some of these networks. And then in a single day or series of days, basically implement a sort of multi-day arrest of anywhere from 5 individuals to up to 120, which was this sort of very large takedown that occurred in 2016. And these takedowns generally were concentrated in certain areas of New York City, particularly near public housing developments, just because in New York City, those are the areas where a lot of these gangs tend to be localized and operate, as well as where a lot of the crime is occurring in the city. The demographics of the arrestees themselves are mostly young or middle-aged men and mostly minority. 54% of them are Black and 38% are Hispanic. So to try to identify and figure out what the effect of these takedowns is on crime, we use publicly available data on all of the arrests that occur in New York City, which are both sort of stamped to a particular location, as well as a particular top charge crime that they are arrested for. And sort of happily for our research, there is a flag for whether the arrest is a conspiracy arrest in that top charge crime, which is rarely used by the NYPD. And when it is used, it's almost always basically used in these gang takedowns. So we're able to use that to basically say, okay, here's where we think gang takedowns occurred. And we identify about 109 of these in and around public housing developments over an 8-year period from 2011 to 2019, associated with 800 plus conspiracy arrests, which are associated with a substantially larger number of total arrests. And these 109 takedowns occur over 73 public housing developments. We're going to focus on the first gang takedown we observe in each of those 73 developments. And we do a directed media search, do some Google searches, things like that, to see if we can find any news articles on each of the takedowns to confirm that we've identified them correctly. We're able to find 53 of the 73 of them with news articles written about the takedowns themselves. When we look just at those 53, our results are appreciably the same. So it's actually the situation here allows us to have a fairly straightforward analytical strategy. Looking at those NYCHA housing developments that experience at least one takedown, we're going to look at the 2 years before the takedown and the 2 years after the takedown to get a sense of how crime changed after the takedown, while also comparing it to other general crime trends in the city to make sure that what we're seeing is really driven by the takedown itself and not by just overall time trends. And something that's sort of helpful for us to be confident these results are driven by the gang takedowns is that there's no real evidence of pre-trends. There's no evidence that the NYPD is choosing particular developments based on some expectation that crime is going to be changing there. There's no evidence that individuals on the ground have any sense that the gang takedown is about to occur. And in addition, the lag time between when these takedown conspiracy investigations begin and when they end is substantially long. It's months or year periods, which is to say that for some individuals, for all of these takedowns, they happen substantially after the takedown is decided to occur. So in some sense, for individuals on the ground, they don't know this is coming. And when it does occur, it sort of happens surprisingly in some sense. So overall, what we observe, and here we're going to show the effect of these takedowns on time periods. Each period on the x-axis here is a 6-month period. We see that after these takedowns, shootings and violent crime more generally both decreased in the city. And while there's some uncertainty in the amount that it decreased, we see a decrease there. And we feel like on average that shootings decreased by about 1/3 in these housing developments after the takedowns occurred. And those effects lasted for 2 years. In violent crime more generally, the effects aren't quite as strong, but they're still statistically significant. So we see about a 10% decrease in violent crime after a gang takedown that lasts for several years. Overall, we also see a decline in homicides, but given the low number of homicides that happen in New York City, we can't be incredibly confident in the significance of that result. There's just not enough homicides happening to see to be confident that homicides are decreasing, but it does appear suggestively that homicides are going down as well. And we see a small and statistically significant decrease in assaults, about 8% decline in assaults. It's worth noting we don't see any effect on nonviolent crime. So there's no changes that we observe after a gang takedown on robberies or property crime. It's also, or nonviolent drug-related arrests or crimes. It's also worth noting that larger takedowns, where more individuals are arrested at once for larger gangs, tend to have larger effects on decreases of crime. We don't see any evidence that crime is displaced to nearby locations. So there's no evidence that individuals are just committing crimes farther away, hoping not to get caught. It appears that crime is decreasing sort of both in the area where the takedown is occurring as well as nearby. And finally, we don't see any evidence this is being driven by enforcement activity changes, that there's more cops on the street. We see no change in the street stops afterwards or general arrests, or as I mentioned before, any sort of nonviolent drug arrests. So we feel fairly confident that the decrease in crime is really being driven by these gang takedowns themselves. So to sum up, we feel fairly confident in saying that these gang takedowns led to a sustained decrease in violent crime in and around these public housing developments. That based on the numbers, appears to explain about 1/4 of the overall decline in violence that happened in these communities. Now, the other 3/4 of the decline in violence could be caused by many of the other factors. We feel confident that about 1/4 of it potentially is driven by these gang takedowns themselves. Before I wrap up, 2 quick notes. The first, words of caution. The first is that we can't identify the exact mechanism of why crime is decreasing, even though we see crime decreasing. It's not clear whether this is being driven by deterrence. The individuals still in these communities are now less likely to commit crimes out of fear of being arrested in the future, or whether it's being driven by incapacitation, with these individuals who are being arrested in these gang takedowns being off the street for a matter of days if they're released on bail, or months if they're held in pretrial detention, or years if they are convicted of those crimes. And then I think an even more important word of caution here is that our work can really just focus on the effects on crime and crime decreases of these gang takedowns. But there are a lot of other effects of this type of policy that we just can't really observe the effects on. And that's, things like the employment, the education, the housing, and the well-being of both the individuals who are arrested as well as the broader community in which they were arrested. And sort of when one's thinking about whether to enact policies like this, I think it's important to think about both the crime effects as well as the non-crime effects. So we can feel confident that crime decreased, but there's a lot of other potential unknowns about the effects of these policies. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Mike. And last but not least is Chloe Gibbs.
All right, I have rarely seen a group stay as on time as this group.
Yes.
Mike, if you don't mind stopping your share so that I can share mine. Thank you. All right. All right, well, I am delighted to present alongside these other great researchers. I am going to shift gears a little bit, but fortunately for me, Sarah did a very nice setup at the beginning of the webinar about sort of the long-term big problems that we might think could help us get some traction on these challenges. So I'm going to be talking about work that is joint with Andrew Barr, who's at Texas A&M. And we're focused here on the very long term, in fact, the intergenerational effects of the Head Start program. So I want to tell you a little bit about Head Start. I know this is a very different sort of policy prescription or programmatic intervention than what we have been talking about. Head Start is, as many of you know, the federally funded program for typically preschool age children, so 3, 4, 5 years old, from disadvantaged families. And it began in 1965 as part of Lyndon B. Johnson's broader war on poverty effort. It was kind of the first out of the gate marquee program in that broader effort, and initially funded summer preschool programs for over 500,000 children. To show you a little bit about what this looks like over time, Head Start currently serves about 1 million children. The enrollment is denoted with this dashed line, to the tune of nearly $1 billion. And at its inception, the White House, which was where the sort of central organizing unit for the War on Poverty programs, the Office of Economic Opportunity, really emphasized medical, cultural, and self-esteem or self-discovery activities as being the purpose of this program serving young children. So you'll note there that there's actually no focus really on cognitive skill development or academic skill building, which is often how we think today about these sorts of early investments. I also want to highlight that Head Start participants were very disadvantaged. They continue to be, the program continues to focus on children from disadvantaged and low-income families today. But at the time of its inception, only 32% of mothers of Head Start children had a high school diploma or more schooling. About 70% of them were unemployed. Also, somewhat shockingly, 9 to 14% of families served by the program in those early years, depending on the year, didn't have running water at home. Infant and child mortality rates in the highest poverty counties in the United States looked like those of developing countries, and very few children in this context were participating in any kind of formal setting, daycare, nursery school, preschool, outside of the home before they entered formal schooling. So that is the context into which Head Start's being introduced. And I also want to emphasize Head Start's role as really a community center. It provided parenting programs, resources on child development, and also a healthcare provider. So for many children who participated in Head Start, this was their first time seeing a doctor and a dentist. And those visits, as chronicled in archival documents, uncovered numerous issues that then had to be addressed for children. So if you study any war on poverty programs, you have the benefit of a great LBJ quote, always, regardless of program. And so this is ours. So when reporting to Congress about the Head Start program, this is in May of 1965. So this is as Head Start is about to roll out across the United States in the summer of 1965. He says, "I believe this response reflects a realistic and a wholesome awakening in America. It shows that we're recognizing that poverty perpetuates itself. 5- and 6-year-old children are inheritors of poverty's curse and not its creators. Unless we act, these children will pass it on to the next generation like a family birthmark." And this is really sort of a motivating aspect of our work. So you see that Head Start hits various communities across the United States. very quickly and somewhat sporadically over those early years. And so we're actually going to capitalize on the introduction of Head Start across counties and the differential timing of that to ask the question of whether Head Start's effects, in fact, transfer across generations. So does it, in fact, break the cycle of poverty as LBJ was describing it in that quote? So we're going to see mothers, or what we call the first generation, in the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, the 1979 cohort, who were very fortuitously for us born from 1957 to the early 1960s. And so their timing of birth, when they're going to be 4 and 5 years old, is going to be right around the time that Head Start is rolling out, as you saw in the previous map of the United States, across communities. And so that is where we will observe Head Start exposure. And then we'll be able to look at their children and the children of the NLSY, what we call the second generation. And also importantly, we have information on the grandmothers in the NLSY 79 that's going to help us isolate or sort of drill down and look at mothers who we think were likely to be exposed to Head Start. And so just to put a finer point on it, if you think back to the map, the way to think about this is we're drawing largely 2 comparisons. One is that we will be comparing a 4-year-old in a county with Head Start to a 4-year-old in a neighboring county that has not yet gotten Head Start, right, based on the rollout across years. Similarly, we will be comparing a, say, 5 or 6-year-old child in a community before they've received Head Start, so that child is just too old to participate, to the child who is the right age, right, the just right age to have been exposed to Head Start. And here's what we find. So first, I'm going to show you, we have these 4 long-term outcomes for the second generation: high school completion, going to college, and then we've sort of reversed the sign on these outcomes. So not being a teen parent and no criminal engagement among a group that was not Head Start exposed. And so these are you can think of these as kind of the baseline rates. And now for those who were Head Start exposed, we see improvements across the board. And just to describe criminal engagement a bit more, this is survey data. So these are going to be self-reported any arrests, convictions, or probations, and also residence in a jail or prison at time of survey. So any of those would be counted as engagement with the criminal justice system. So this constitutes, Head Start exposure in the first generation constitutes a 12.5 percentage point reduction in criminal engagement for those whose moms were just right age to be Head Start exposed in the right place. I also want to show you this as compared to, so these are the high impact sample that I just showed you before. So these are individuals whose grandmothers did not complete high school. So we think they're very likely to have been exposed to Head Start if it was available in their county at the right time. These are the rates that we just saw in the previous slide for the Head Start exposed group. And I'm going to show you this compared to those whose grandmothers had high school education or more, what we think of as kind of an unlikely to have been exposed to Head Start sample. And what you see is that this intervention effectively closes the gap on these long-term outcomes. In fact, you see the Head Start exposed group in terms of not being engaged with the criminal justice system is doing better than a more advantaged group, a group whose grandmothers were more advantaged, right? So effectively closing that gap across generations. And so what are some of the mechanisms through which we might realize these long-term outcomes? So those outcomes that I showed you in the previous slides, we collapse those into 2 kind of summary metrics. One is that it's about a 1/4 of a standard deviation improvement in a summary index, a standardized index, if you're familiar with those that have been used in some of the long-term effects literature, but also corresponds to about a $35,000 summary wage improvement. So those outcomes, improvements across those outcomes, correspond to about a $35,000 improvement in your wages by age 35. So how is the Head Start rollout in the first generation improving that second generation set of outcomes? And we explore this a bit in our data. What we see is the main outcome that's improving for the first generation. Remember, these are all moms. So we actually can't really do the comparable criminal engagement metric for these women because those effects in the second generation and in other literature that has looked at the first generation effects of Head Start are concentrated among men. But we see educational attainment improvements for the moms. And then in the second generation, before those long-term outcomes are realized, we see that they themselves are more likely to participate in preschool and Head Start. They have better home and parenting environments as measured by these home scores. They're less likely to repeat a grade. They're less likely to have any sort of engagement with the criminal justice system as an adolescent. And they report higher levels of self-esteem. So these are likely some of the channels through which those broad improvements in long-term outcomes are being realized. So a few kind of key takeaways, I think, from this work. I think first that this is an existence proof that early childhood interventions can in fact have these lasting effects that transfer to the next generation, effectively breaking the cycle of poverty. And I think it's important to measure these preschool effects across generations. It should form how we think about the kinds of investments we make, both in young children and in their communities, and then how we measure the return on those investments. Our evidence suggests that in fact, the second generation benefits alone pass a cost benefit test. And there's other evidence both from first generation effects of Head Start and from the Perry preschool program that the criminal justice effects, the reductions in engagement with the criminal justice system, can pay for the program in and of themselves. We think the second generation effects here are likely driven both through the direct effects of own preschool participation, right? We saw that this group, the second generation, is more likely to participate in preschool themselves, and through the many indirect effects of mothers' educational attainment improvements, right? And these are likely cumulative, multi-channeled, and affecting children both prenatally and in their early years and across childhood. I think it is important to note as a final point that we are always chasing these long run effects. Head Start is in fact the only context in which in the United States, we've had a long enough time horizon from the deployment of a large scale early childhood program to explore these intergenerational effects. But of course, given that framework and that setting, much has changed since then. And so it's somewhat challenging to think about the translation of these effects to current contexts and current programs and policies. But I think, again, we can demonstrate through this work that these kinds of programs can have these substantial spillovers to the second generation that are probably important when we think about the full effects and the full benefits realized by these programs. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Chloe. Awesome, well, we are done with 2 minutes to spare. Thank you so much to all of our terrific presenters, and thanks to everyone for attending. The recording of this webinar will be posted on the Niskanen Center's website, and you can join us here again, same time, same place next week for another round of 5 quick research talks on how to reduce violent crime. So thank you all again, and I'll see you next week.